DNS, the domain naming system. In this section, we'll talk about DNS and what it does as a service. We'll talk about the domain naming structure. We'll talk about sources for domain names. These are names like www.learntosubnet.com. Also, how you register a domain name. We'll talk about the different pieces of DNS software there is. We'll talk briefly in general on how to configure DNS. Then we'll see exactly how DNS works, and then we'll close out by talking about how DNS operates on the internet. DNS as a service. Now, we're all used to connecting up to the internet, sitting on our computers, and typing in the fully qualified domain name or the URL of the website we want to connect to. For instance, if you wanted to connect to learntosubnet.com, we type in www.learntosubnet.com. Now, domain names are fully qualified domain names, which we'll talk about in a second, or these URLs are the way we're used to connecting to websites. But the truth is for your computer to connect to that website and download the information from the website, your computer needs the IP address of the website. And here's an example of an IP address, 100.109.23.144. So DNS as a service, what it does is it provides what's called IP name resolution. So when you type in that name, DNS, the DNS software on your computer, goes out and retrieves the IP address of the destination computer so that your computer then can set up a TCP connection to the destination website and then download the information from that website. So DNS provides IP name resolution. It also is a distributed database of all the domain names and all the websites and their corresponding IP addresses. Domain naming system. Now, we first talked about DNS as a service, the service that provides IP resolution. Now let's talk about another important aspect of it, which is the naming system itself, because the domain naming system is a hierarchical naming system used to give each server on the internet a unique name. Now let's take a look at our URL, www.learntosubnet.com. Now this is a URL, also called a fully qualified domain name, and it's really three different names, and let's see how they're made up. Now the name to the farthest right.com is always the top level domain name. Now these names are determined by the internet, and these are the ones that we're familiar with either as .com, .net, .org, .us, any of the other countries you may be familiar with. Now the name second from the left is always the individual organization or company's domain name that they've registered with the internet. Then the name on the farthest left is always the host name, which is really the name of the computer you're connecting to. Now when you take the host name and add the domain name plus the top level domain name, we have a complete domain name, or I guess what we'd call a FQDN, a fully qualified domain name, also what we call a URL. A couple quick additional notes. Now, domains can have subdomains. For instance, I could have www.northamerica.learntosubnet.com. North America would be a subdomain of learntosubnet.com. I could also have www.southamerica.learntosubnet.com. Now again, the farthest left name is the host name or the computer name, and then the name to the right is either a subdomain or a domain, and then the name on the farthest right is always the top level domain, the ones determined by the internet, the com, the nets, the orgs. In addition, the host name www is really just the name of a computer. Now it could be a lot of other names. It could be, for instance, just about any name you wanted. For instance, it could be support, it could be US, it could be anything. The thing about www is that there is this informal convention that the default or the normal website people connect to is always named www, just to make it a little bit easier for people to connect to websites. Now, so the domain naming system is a system that makes sure that each server on the internet has a unique name, and then we're going to see that DNS is also a database and keeps track of all the fully qualified domain names, the domain names, and their associated IP addresses. Domain name structure. As we talked in the previous slide, DNS provides a naming method that assures that each server on the internet has a unique name. Now here's a picture of the organizational structure that's used to assure this. Now as mentioned before, this naming structure is a hierarchical structure. It starts with a root, and below the root are the top level domains. This is the com, the net, the gov, the org, and then the two-letter codes associated with in each different country. Now these names, the top level domains, are determined by the Internet Naming Organization, and we'll talk about that naming organization later. And then under each top level domain are the individual names registered by companies and organizations. And each of these must be unique. Now for instance, when Ron Popeil registered the Ronco name underneath the com domain, he's of course the only one who could register that name because all these names must be unique. Now remember, a fully qualified domain name is the host name plus the domain name. Now for instance, the default web server name, host name for most computers is www. Now the way you come up with a fully qualified domain name is you take the host name plus the domain name, and the domain name is all the names to the root of the naming structure. Now for instance, the www server for Ronco would be www.ronco.com. Sources of domain names. In the past, an organization called IANA oversaw the domain name registration process, and this organization was funded by the National Science Foundation in the U.S. government. Currently, an organization called ICANN oversees the domain registration process. Now, this organization is a nonprofit organization and has participants worldwide. Now, ICANN oversees the domain name registration, but they do not actually maintain the database of names. Now there is a master database of domain names. Now this is called the shared database. Now this database, the physical database, is maintained under contract from ICANN to an organization called Network Solutions. And Network Solutions receives about $6 per name per year to maintain this database. Now when you register a domain name with Network Solutions, you probably pay about $35 per year. $6 goes towards the maintenance of the master database, and the rest goes towards the administrative expenses of Network Solutions. In the past, Network Solutions was really the only organization that you could register domain names with. But ICANN wanted to drive that price down by adding competition to this registration process, and what they've done is they've approved additional registers, and that list of registers can be viewed at the ICANN website. Now the hope is that once these registers start competing, they'll drive the price down, and hopefully it won't cost $35 per year per domain name. It'll hopefully cost a lot less. Registering a domain name. Now if I had a domain name I wanted to register, I would first contact a domain register. Now I'm going to use Network Solutions in this example because it's the one I'm familiar with, but you could use any of the authorized registers. Now if I've got my name, I'll go up to Network Solutions site and I'll use one of their search tools to determine if somebody else has that name. And it's getting a little bit tricky these days because there's an excess of 15 million domain names already taken, and so the name you may want may already be taken. But by searching through the network, the shared database information there, you can determine if the name is taken or not. Once I've determined a unique domain name, I will register it with the register. Now they're going to want my charge card because it's going to cost me in today's terms $35 a year to register each domain name. But as part of that registration process, it's going to ask me for the names and IP addresses of the two DNS servers that are going to store information, DNS information, for my domain. Now if I'm a larger company, I may very well want to create those DNS servers myself. Now if I create the DNS servers myself, what I'll need to do is create host records also up at Network Solutions site or register site for my DNS servers. Now, if I'm a smaller company and some other organization is hosting my website, maybe it's a hosting company or maybe it's a internet service provider, I would put in the names and IP addresses of the DNS servers that are provided by either the hosting company or the ISP, and they can provide that information for you. Registering a domain name, best practices. Now, a couple quick issues when you register a domain name. Number one, make sure you own it, which means register it yourself. If you now have your internet service provider register for it, there may be an issue somewhere down the road if the ISP owns it or you own it. Make sure you own it, register itself, pay for it yourself. Also, of course, when you're trying to pick out that perfect domain name, use good marketing skills. Make sure that the domain name means something to your customers. Also, one of the recommendations is to pass the billboard test. A domain name should be a name that if you saw it driving to work on a billboard, you could, when you got to work, actually type it in. So it's easy to use, it means something, just basic good marketing skills. Also, be sure to get related names. For instance, if I wanted to register a name, something like giantcolor.com, the truth is they spell color different in different countries. I would make sure that I registered both spellings. Also, would I register just super color, no dashes, or would I also register super dash color? I would certainly register both, because if I was successful and just had one, I could expect a competitor to register the other one. And also, I wouldn't get just supercolor.net or .com. I'd also get .net, .org, and even larger companies are getting all of them with all the country abbreviations. You can see that if you really wanted to lock down your names, it could get quite expensive in a hurry. In part 2 of DNS, we'll first talk about DNS software. We'll talk about resolver and name servers. We'll look at a detailed example of how DNS works. We'll talk in a very general sense about configuring DNS. We'll talk about what you have to do when you place DNS servers on the internet. We'll also talk about how DNS is set up and works on the internet. We'll talk about the root level servers, how they're configured and how they're managed. We'll also talk about the top level domain servers. And then finally we'll close off with talking about who's responsible for DNS in organizations.